Hi, welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. This is Washington Policy Center's monthly webinar series where we talk with center directors about their latest work and research. And this is a special edition this week. Ordinarily, we wouldn't even do an episode like this during a week of our annual dinner. Our Spokane annual dinner is this Friday. Our Bellevue annual dinner already took place. It was a fantastic event, and you'll be able to see some highlights, we hope, on YouTube coming up. But the Spokane annual dinner takes place this Friday. This is a special edition, though, because it is our election resources guide edition. And with ballots coming soon, we want people to be able to make educated decisions and have as much information as possible about the things that we've written about before they cast their ballot. And so this will be particularly enlightening for those of you living in Bellingham or Yakima. But the other point of this particular series is that some of the ballot measures that are local, that are pertaining specifically right now to Bellingham and Yakima, also have statewide implications and are we're very likely to see them at a statewide level or at new localities. So even if you do not live in Bellingham or Yakima, these issues are likely to pertain to you fairly soon. So we'll be tackling two issues in Bellingham and one issue in Yakima. And then, of course, next month, we'll have a whole new series on for Washington Policy on the Go. We're going to start with Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director, and then we'll visit with Mark Harmsworth, our Small Business Director, and our Vice President for Research, Paul Guppy. They'll be talking about the Bellingham initiatives. Jason will be speaking with us about the Yakima initiatives. And then after we go through some of what they've uncovered in their Citizens Guide publications that are available now at washingtonpolicy.org, we'll take your questions. So if at any point during this presentation you have a question, please put it in the little Q&A box. It's probably on the bottom of your screen, might be on the side of your screen, depending on how you have Zoom laid out. But put your question in at any time, and then we'll get to all your questions at the end of this seminar. Jason, welcome. Thank you.
Hey, David, thanks for having me. And to your point about how, even though this is a Yakima Proposition 3 local income tax ban we're going to be talking about, this policy is showing up across the state. And in fact, tonight, I'm actually going to be testifying before the DuPont City Council because they are considering the same thing. So I'm glad you're all attending tonight because this policy definitely can be expanded across the state.
Yeah, and let's get to what that policy is and how it came to be. Yakima is seeking to ban, Yakima's Proposition 3 is seeking to ban a local income tax. Some people have called this theater, saying it's not necessary. Others are pointing out and saying, no, Yakima's onto something here. Explain to us why you feel Yakima is doing the right thing.
So if we were having this discussion in 2017, I would have been confused. Why are we talking about banning a local income tax? It's clearly against state law. Local governments are creatures of the state, which means they have no power unless the legislature provides that authority to them. And the legislature has never given cities or counties permission to tax income. And in fact, in 1984, the legislature actually passed a very simple one-page bill, and it was trying to clear up some confusion from a prior constitutional amendment about city-county governments. And all this 1984 law said is that a city, county cannot tax income. So you had no grant of authority, you had an explicit prohibition. Why are we even talking about this? We're talking about this because our friends in the city of Seattle City Council kind of opened the doors across the state to a local income tax. And they did this by passing their Seattle income tax. And they did it willfully and knowingly violating the law, but they were trying to create a test case to see if they could get the Supreme Court to open the door across Washington to income taxes. Now, they failed on their particular policy, but things went a little bit sideways at the Court of Appeals, opening this door.
And now that the door is open, we see a number of cities moving forward and banning income taxes. Who has been in line before Yakima at this point? In other words, which other cities in Washington have stepped forward and already banned local income taxes?
So we've seen several cities act, but this is going to only be the second time the voters get to. The very first was the city of Spokane. They also had a charter amendment. And what I mean by that, there are a couple of types of cities in the state of Washington. There are those first-class charter cities, and they basically have city constitutions. They can do ballot measures, and that's why the voters get a chance to come in and set their charter. And both in Spokane, banning the local income tax, and that's what Yakima gets to vote on here in a few weeks. The other type are your code cities, and those cities that have acted would be Spokane Valley, Granger, Kennewick, Union Gap, Moses Lake, and I mentioned DuPont will possibly be considered it tonight. Now, those code cities, it's basically, it's not a mission statement, but the next city council can come in and change that, but it adds an extra step, and it makes it very clear to businesses and individuals that as a local government, we're not going to take advantage of this new authority. And what I mean by the new authority, when this went to the Court of Appeals, the City of Seattle income tax in 2019, the Court of Appeals said, Seattle, your specific tax is unconstitutional because it's graduated. But then they did two very strange things. They said that since income is property, which is what the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled, and we know the legislature has given local governments property tax authority, therefore every local government can tax income. And then they took the next step and said, and by the way, that 1984 one-page bill the legislature passed, that's unconstitutional. Somehow it violated single subject. And that's why now every municipality in the state of Washington can impose a flat 1% income tax, which is why you've seen these cities, and actually one county, Yakima County, has also acted to close that door and say, no, we do not want to go down the road of taxing income.
So the people of Yakima have a pretty straightforward question before them, in that would you, the citizens, like to, in this Proposition 3, ban local income taxes or not? So it's not a complicated vote. It's and then the power of the vote will come in part from the percentage. In Spokane, the vote was pretty overwhelming. And I'd remind people, Spokane, even though it's an Eastern Washington city, it's a pretty mixed bag. I mean, it's a blue city in a sea of red over there. In that, it's got Democrat representation in the Senate and the House. It's not a right-wing town, and yet, over 70% of the people said we don't want local income taxes, which shows that this is not a partisan issue by any stretch.
I mean, not only was it 72%, which I think in any definition of election is a landslide, it passed in every city precinct. So every precinct in the city of Spokane passed this. And as you mentioned, the only two Democrats in the legislature in Eastern Washington come from Spokane. So that passed in their districts as well. And this is not a surprise, right? 10 straight times by 60, 70% statewide, voters have said, we do not want an income tax. So the fact that local voters are reiterating, no, we don't want this, shouldn't be a surprise. Now, the beautiful thing about charter cities, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of them, but Spokane is one, Yakima is one, Richland is another one in Eastern Washington, and you've got a handful on the west side, is if the charter is changed, the council can't do something without changing that charter. And a charter amendment requires a vote of the people. So if Proposition 3 passes as it is expected to here in a few weeks, that means there will be no opportunity for the city council in Yakima to impose an income tax without a vote of the people.
Yeah, and that's more powerful. Like you say, in some cities, if one city council puts it forward, another city council can come and reverse it. But it's still a step where they're putting up a neon sign that says, "Watch us increase, watch us create an income tax," which can be a helpful warning to people. But this other kind of step is much bigger.
If you think about this, even if you were a code city, and this, like I mentioned, I'll be testifying before DuPont tonight, and we've heard some other cities as well. There's only two issues, right? Either you as a city council don't want an income tax, or you do. And by failing to say that we don't want an income tax, that leaves the only other solution or possible option being that we do want to take advantage of this at some point when we have the vote. So even if the next council can come in and change it, it just really does send that message back that we don't want this. And when we talk about sending a message, it's not just to your local community. What's happening right now at the state level? You have the legislature, even though the rest of the country was cutting taxes, our legislature this year passed the first standalone income tax on capital gains in the country. We raised taxes. And they did it for the explicit purpose of, just like the city of Seattle, trying to create a test case to see if they can get the rules of the game changed, to see if they can get an income tax through without a constitutional amendment. And you've also got this effort now traveling the state. You might have heard of these tax town halls. And about a month ago, we turned over our program to the Department of Revenue. There's this legislative study going around trying to make the case to Washingtonians about why you've been wrong rejecting these income taxes. So the benefit of all of these cities passing these bans is kind of reiterating that message back to the legislature as well. Like, what part of no don't you understand? Let's move on to other conversations.
It's interesting. I saw, I can't recall if it was a social media post or if it was an in-print op-ed critical of Yakima's asking voters this question and giving them this opportunity to ban a local income tax, because it was supposed to be a waste of time, waste of voter resources and other things. And what it reminded me of, and I think I've mentioned this before, is when I worked in the legislature, there was a proposal by then Senator Fortunato. And it was I think it was a constitutional amendment to ban income taxes. And repeatedly, over and over and over again, you had people standing up saying, what a waste of time. This is a total waste of time. In fact, they spent so much time telling everyone it was a waste of time. The obvious, the obvious solution was to be quiet and just vote for it. If it's so unnecessary and so obvious and everybody doesn't want an income tax, then why not just pass it? But of course, instead it was voted down, and I just thought it was kind of fascinating to watch. And there's a similar kind of oh, why don't hey, everybody in these small towns, just forget about it. Cities everywhere, don't worry about it. Don't pass this. Total waste of your time. And yet, you've uncovered emails through public records requests showing that the real intent of a lot of these kinds of efforts is broader income taxes all over the place. So,
I just like you, I remember very vividly that floor debate where senator after senator speaking against it said, nobody's talking about an income tax. And one brave soul actually stood up and said, well, I want an income tax. I've actually sponsored it.
That was great.
Just a few years later, what do we have? We have the capital gains income tax. We have this taxpayer funded study trying to convince Washingtonians to get an income tax. So obviously they're talking about it. They're just not listening.
And you uncovered emails. Some of the emails that you got through public records show that some of the very people that were on the floor saying, nobody wants this income tax, we're talking about an income tax on emails around that same time period.
Yeah, and the actual quotes from those emails from these senators, and I don't think he's going to be ashamed of it. It's Democratic Senator Peterson, who is one of the supporters of this, said he thinks the capital gains tax is their best shot to get an income tax in the state of Washington, because they think they can get the court to overturn their prior rulings. This is not the litigation right now against this is not a flaw. It's the goal of their policy.
One more thing before we move along, you did mention revenue, and you mentioned that other states are cutting taxes while Washington State has been increasing taxes. So I did want to bring up revenue for a moment, because another issue that you've been bringing up is a sales tax cut. And even though that's not on the ballot this time around, it's not an election resource, it is something I think that people can be informed about and make better decisions based on this. You've been calling for any kind of sales tax cut. Explain why there's an overwhelming case in favor of a sales tax cut for Washington State right now.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Washington and New York, I think, were the only states this year that didn't cut taxes and raise taxes instead, right? So that means California, Oregon, Idaho, and they're cutting taxes because after the economic restrictions imposed by the governors for the pandemic were loosened, you saw significant activity in the economies. And those huge deficits that we were told were coming not only evaporated, but you've seen substantial revenue growth. And in the state of Washington, as of our most recent revenue forecast, which was just a few weeks ago in September, you have a balanced budget, you have billions in reserves, you have billions of federal LEAF funds that haven't been spent yet. And as a result of the forecast, you have $3.6 billion in unanticipated revenue since the legislature left town. So balanced budget, billions in reserves, $3.6 billion of unanticipated revenue. Oh, by the way, the governor just agreed to pay raises with unionized employees for over $450 million. So you're going to tell me that with all of that, you can't provide the very first sales tax cut since 1982?
And this is pay raises in the midst of the raised pay that was just negotiated. Like,
Yeah, so this is a mid-budget cycle pay raise.
exactly.
Which usually does not happen. Now, the base budget didn't provide them because the governor wasn't sure what was happening with the forecast. But what you need to realize with state employees is everybody gets a step increase unless you're at the very top of the wage scale. So it's not like nobody is getting an increase. So this is a 3.25% pay raise, resetting those scales, plus a lump sum payment that does diminish the higher your income. But all told, it's $450+ million of pay raises. So if we can afford a pay raise, we should be able to afford a tax cut.
Just a shameless plug, we have a new video that Washington Policy Center just released, an animated explainer video detailing the overwhelming case for a sales tax cut. We'll have that, the link to that video in the chat section before this episode is over so that you can watch it and share it. And we hope you share it with as many people as possible because the numbers are pretty overwhelming. It's pretty fascinating. And one more quick thing, Jason, we wanted to mention, the governor has a press conference coming up detailing with possible new emergency restrictions. Tell us what that's about.
So this Thursday at 2:30 p.m., the governor does have a press conference. The details have not been released, but the past practice is usually some new mandate is imposed upon us via a press conference, which is a very odd way to be governed with a small r Republican form of government with separations of powers. But I don't know if we're going to have new mandates. The two that have been floating out there that people are prepared for is for the governor to impose the vaccine mandate on all employers at around 50 employees. That's been rumored from the industries to be coming. Another possible one is taking the King County passport requirement, vaccine passports, and doing that statewide. So those may or may not be coming this Thursday. Those are the two that are most likely next on the governor's agenda. On Friday at 2 p.m. will be the court hearing in Thurston County's Superior Court over the governor's vaccine mandates from state employees challenging that. So those are two things related to that. The reason we mention it is I think you're going to be plugging our emergency powers reform video as well. It's time to go back to normal governance. We have got to get back to governing through the legislature, not press conferences. And hopefully we can get to that very soon.
And as you pointed out, that goes for whether you agree with every policy or not. There is a certain process. We're supposed to have a representational process, and that we're long overdue on that. Again, a nonpartisan issue, but we will put the link to that new explainer video up as well. We hope you share that one as well. I'm sure it'll be a popular subject, at least for the next couple of weeks. Jason, we'll get back to you during the question period coming up at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much. Let's bring forward our Center for Small Business Director, Mark Harmsworth. Mark, let's talk about Bellingham's Initiative 4. And, you know, it's dealing with issues like rent control, but the way they phrase it is it's like relocation assistance for people who are struggling perhaps with their rent. Tell us about this initiative and what it would do in Bellingham.
Yeah, thanks for hosting today, Dave. I very much appreciate it. Yeah, so there are 4 initiatives that are running up in Bellingham right now. Initiative 1, which is the rent one. Initiative 4 is the extra restrictions they're putting on employers. But what they're basically doing is saying, look, somewhat similar to what the governor did with the rent mandates. They're saying, hey, we've got this rent moratorium, but now what they're saying is they're putting restrictions on these property owners and saying, look, if you raise the rent too fast and too high, you're going to have to basically give money to these renters. And then if they leave as a result of you increasing the rent, you're going to help them relocate to their new house. So effectively help them get into the next house.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mark. I started talking to you about our Vice President for Research is Bellingham's Initiative 1, which is the rent control. I meant to talk to you about workplace scheduling, which is Initiative 4, which is your citizens guide on that. So,
well, thankfully, I know about both issues. So
I figured as much, but Paul Guppy will be joining us here shortly to talk about the rent control issue there. I like a Bellingham voter, was a bit confused by all the new restrictions and possibilities opening up for restrictions on the way I go about my business. And I do have family in the Bellingham area, so so this one is of high interest in my household there. So let's talk about Initiative 4, since
Yes.
you wrote the Citizens Guide on that, and that's the workplace, some of the workplace restrictions that they seek to impose. Usually this is done in the name of helping workers, of
Yes.
making sure that workers aren't inconvenienced because of oppressive employers.
Right.
Describe what happens with if Initiative 4 in Bellingham were to pass. What kinds of things should people expect in terms of government control over workplace schedules?
Yeah, so the scheduling thing is, it's incredibly difficult if you're, and put yourself in the shoes of, say, a retailer at Christmas. So you don't know yet, depending on what the governor mandates on you, whether you can open your doors or not. You don't know yet how really you're going to be able to schedule your time. So typically what's happening is you're trying to handle the new customer load that's coming in because it's Christmas, and you're trying to deal with that. And then you'll say, okay, Joey and Sally, I want to schedule you for some hours next week. And Joey and Sally come in, but then maybe the customers don't show up. And so now you're having to, you talk to Joey and Sally and say, well, I don't have any work for you right now. So sorry about that. I'll try and do what I can, but you're going to need to go home. Well, this new initiative basically does, it says to the employer, you have to accurately assess the amount of hours that you need to book ahead of time without really knowing what's going to happen. And then if you book those people and there is no work, you still have to pay them anyway at a reduced rate, but you still have to pay them anyway. So you can imagine, and for like a restaurant, which profit margins in restaurants and retail are incredibly low, typically in the 3 or 4% range, how much that's going to impact how an employer wants to schedule that time. And then secondly, as they're trying to figure this out, their incentive now is to either not book enough hours and then ask you to come and do more, or just not book you for those hours at all, or do something else themselves. So it's a very, even though on the surface it looks like, oh, I'm going to get guaranteed hours, and these nasty little employers are never going to be able to make me work when I don't want to. What this initiative basically will do is put them in a box and force them to make decisions where they won't be able to offer as many hours, and you won't get to work as many hours. So it's actually an anti-work initiative when you look at the real numbers, and that's exactly how it's going to play out.
Interesting things, I think, is a disconnect between that's often there between people who are working for a company and the needs of the company itself, or as you were pointing out, profit margins, when people think, hey, there's a big grocery store, they're just making a ton, and then it turns out maybe they're making 2%, which would be a high profit margin in some industries there.
Right. As a small business owner as well, the money is coming out of your pocket. So for a lot of people that don't really think about this, they think it's some kind of mega corporation that's got all this money stashed away. Imagine today if I came to you and said, let's start a store, and I'd like you to buy all the stock right out of your own bank account. How would, most of us would just look at it and go, well, that's going to cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm like, exactly. That's the point. These profit margins are coming out of the pockets of the individual business owners. And, some of them can't afford it.
Yeah, and in this case, when you say they are forcing employers to, this would force employers to schedule work hours a year in advance. I'm just trying to imagine scheduling, especially the last 2 years, which have been crazy, but anywhere in a year in advance. Even the government calls special sessions and other things. They won't necessarily know what's going to happen a year in advance.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big ask, I think, on the part of the, the whole point of overtime is that you don't know in advance, otherwise you would have scheduled regular shifts. You didn't know that those people were going to be needed, right?
Right, and there's two components. There's the piece where they're going to have to pay for the hours that you work. That's the sort of the 2 to 4 week range. Yeah. But as you said, you're accurate in saying the employer, when they hire you in the first place, has to say, I'm going to have you work, my estimate is this number of hours per year. And if you're in retail, or you think about the cake store down the street, they don't know what demand's going to be. They can guess, but for them to be then tied into that, they're not going to want to take the risk. And so you're going to see a lot of employers underbooking hours and then having to pay more overtime, and therefore they can't afford more employees.
One of the key findings that you had in your citizens guide here is that this initiative would ban employers from creating new jobs without first getting written permission from current employees first.
That's correct. Yeah. So you're back to your Christmas scenario. If you realize your hot chocolate cakes are going to be, or your squeaky chair, if you're a radio host, are going to be selling really, really well this year. And so you want to bring in some extra people to help you out there. You're going to have to go back to your existing employees who can basically hold you hostage and say, hey, no, we don't want to work it, but we're going to withhold our signature for maybe a week or two. They could be disgruntled. It could be anything like that. And you're trying to ramp up. You're trying to get the people in to help. And because hiring takes a while, and you're not going to be able to sell those cakes and chairs because you don't have the people to support it.
Yeah, that would certainly curtail innovation, especially quick responses to maybe markets that you weren't expecting, or when I say markets, what I mean is demand, people looking for certain services. So, if you needed to create a quick job and you have to go and get some kind of employee vote, that would strike me as a real sluggish way in order for a company to respond.
Yeah. I mean, realistically, most employers are going to go back to their employees, the ones they have already, and say, hey, I've got some extra work. Do you want to try and do it? And, 99% of the time, the employer will go, yeah, I can give an extra 5 hours or 10 hours here or what have you. But for you to have to go to all your employees and get them to sign off on your new jobs, I don't think that's going to work that great.
There's also a tracking issue, as a small business owner yourself, I look at this list and I see a lot of tracking and paperwork that would potentially weigh down a company. If you're dotting, you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's here, just to make sure you could prove that you followed these procedures.
Yeah, every single one of these state laws that pass, whether it's this one, whether it's the pay family leave, whether it's the long-term care, which is coming our way in January here, all of these laws add 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day to somebody having to track and maintain this. You start adding all of this up, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. Suddenly, as a small business, instead of trying to sell your product or your service, you're now having to deal with literally government bureaucracy and filing your quarterly taxes, trying to pay all this stuff on time, making sure you've done the right form, making sure your license is displayed correctly on the wall in the corner in the appropriate plastic box, and all these types of rules. You end up having to hire somebody to take care of this stuff. And that's more money out of your pocket at the end of the day. Remember, it's your bank account that's paying for this. And eventually you can't afford it all. If you're only making 3% on your food sales and you have to go hire a person to deal with your 10-person restaurant that you've got, and that person's dedicated to HR and just making sure that you're good with these rules, that can cost you $50,000, $60,000 a year once you factor in all the different taxes and things.
You wrote that employees, even if they wanted to work certain shifts, they might not be allowed to under these rules. How would that work?
Yeah, so the employee, it's sort of a little bit of both, but the employee can basically say, look, I don't want to work on Christmas Day. You can't make me work on Christmas Day. So off they go. So you end up with employers that may not even be able to get people to work on specific days. Whereas now under an employment contract, they can say part of your job is there will be days that you need to work outside of your 40 hours and you're going to get compensated. You'll get time and a half or whatever the agreement is in the contract. But with this, at the last minute, they can also say, no, you can't do this. They can also decide that they want to go to college or some other, good things to do, but they could do it and basically tell the employer when they're going to do it. So, you could have people taking time off over the holidays and really messing things up for the employer. At the end of the day, the jobs will just disappear.
Do you see a statewide implication or expanded implication of what the vote is in Bellingham, and if so, what is it?
Yeah, the state's already tried passing a lot of the stuff that's in Bellingham, but it just didn't make it through the legislative process last time. But I'll tell you one thing, if I'm an employer and I'm considering where I'm going to place my business, I am not looking at Bellingham now. So those Bellingham residents that are in that area, unfortunately, are going to lose out of a lot of opportunities because the employers are either going to move away from the area or they're going to be on the outskirts of the city to avoid these types of regulations. At the state level, I wonder if this is really a litmus test to see if The folks down in Olympia will want to run this again next year. I'm sure they will, to see if they can do this statewide. And then the same problems will exist, and you'll see businesses choose to go elsewhere. It's just too draconian. Some of these restrictions are. You just can't make your business work.
Two additional points that that you make in your citizens guide that I'd like to address here on this Bellingham Initiative 4. You say that it would require all employers to pay $4 more per hour during a declared state of emergency, even for people working from home. So this is be a way of forcing a third party to pay emergency pay, even if there is no danger to the job that you're performing.
Yeah, the initiative does not define what a safe or an unsafe job is. So because of the ADA Act and anti-discrimination, that looks like Mr. Guppy is joining us just now.
Yeah, I see.
I don't know if he's aware that he's joining us just now, but it's a great sideshow that we're watching here.
I stopped this video.
Yeah, that's good. But they don't differentiate between frontline or not frontline. And this is some of the issues that you have with these types of initiatives that are run. So you end up in a situation where you may have 5 employees that are frontline, maybe they're working front counter, and you've got 5 that are working in the back in marketing or something, or even at home. You have to pay them the same. You can't discriminate against them. So it literally, it's a way of increasing the minimum wage while under a state of emergency. And normally these emergency orders only last 30 days. But as we've pointed out earlier today with the emergency powers, we're coming up to 2 years now when we hit January being under emergency order. So, for some of these folks that are making minimum wage, so $15, a $4 increase, it's a 22%, whatever some mathematician will tell me the exact number, but increase that you've had to pay for 2 years. If you're making 4% and now you've got a 22% increase on your wages, what's going to happen? You got to lay people off. So it literally is it'll have the opposite effect of what you think it will. You'll get less hours and there'll be less jobs available.
Yeah, I was just thinking if from an employer's perspective or a small business perspective, trying to plan for the wages for your employees. And as you point out, for many small business owners, it's coming directly from their pocket. Suddenly you've got a third party government stepping in and saying, P.S. we're going to make you pay this. That's a huge burden on a lot of individuals. That's a big one. Finally, you also say that it would force employers to hire people who are in the country illegally and deny job opportunities to other members of the community. How does that work? How did the immigration debate get into Bellingham's Initiative 4?
They basically said that you're discriminating against somebody if you check their I-9 authorization form. And for those of you who don't know, your I-9 form is the form you have to present to show that you're here legally in the country. If you're on a visa, like an H-1B visa, or you're a green card holder, you can show your green card, obviously, but your I-9 basically says, hey, I'm authorized to work here. If an employer is not allowed to ask for those immigration forms and then denies the job applicant, they put themselves in a situation where they could be sued because of discrimination, even unwittingly discriminate against an employee, which that's wrong. So all the employees that I hire, I want to see their immigration status. I'm an immigrant myself. I went through the process legally. It's very expensive, but it can be done. So that's why you don't want this situation, because it then denies an American from being able to get in there and work as well. And it makes the employees more nervous. I
was about to say it might also put the employers in a tough spot because it's a double-edged sword. I mean, if they could get in trouble also if they're violating other laws. Appreciate that, Mark. We'll get to the Q&A section. If anyone has a question for Mark Harmsworth regarding Bellingham's Initiative 4 or possible statewide implications of that initiative on workplace scheduling controls, you can ask us a question in the Q&A box below. It's probably at the bottom of your screen on Zoom or on the side of your screen. You can ask that question anytime, and at the end of this presentation, we'll answer all the questions that you have. So ask the question anytime, and we'll get right to it. Now I'd like to turn to Paul Guppy, our Vice President of Research, soon to be interim president, I think starting Monday, but right now just VP, soon P. So Paul, thanks so much. I know you had a very hectic day and just arrived. You wrote a citizen's guide for Bellingham's Initiative 1, which is on rent control, and but it's not the initiative itself claims to be more for relocation services. Describe that discrepancy. How is it that they're defining these relocation services?
Sure. So the supporters of this initiative, they know that the phrase rent control or price controls are unworkable, they're unpopular, they've been tried in other cities and they don't work. So they completely avoided putting the words rent control in the initiative. And instead they call it, a relocation assistance. But when you actually read the text of the initiative, you see that the relocation assistance has to come from the landlord or the property owner, who is a private person. So in economics, what do you call that? A price control. It's a rent control. Normally, when you hear of public assistance for people to move from one place to the other, you think of government tax-funded assistance. And that's not what this initiative is at all. It puts very tight restrictions on the ability to rent property to tenants. And that, in marketing terms, that is a rent control. And that's how this initiative would work.
This subject came up just very briefly earlier, and we had one audience member say, well, look, the mayor of Seattle said no to a similar thing earlier and pushed back really hard, saying that this is counterproductive and a bad idea. And the Bellingham City Council, as you point out in your key findings in the Citizens Guide publication, Bellingham City Council also rejected this measure and forwarded it to the voters. Why did the Bellingham Council reject the measure?
Because they know that it's unworkable and that it's unpopular. So the Bellingham City Council didn't want to go on record as voting for what is an essentially rent control and all the damaging that effects that would have in the housing market in Bellingham. So instead, they just dodged it. And the council said, well, we'll just allow this to go on the ballot in front of the voters. That way, they don't have to be accountable or responsible for it. But again, as a think tank, we don't look at the political process of who's in favor of it or who isn't. We look at the quality of the idea itself and what impact it would have on the community. And whether it's Seattle or Bellingham or New York or San Francisco, who have all tried rent control in the past, the underlying flaw of this idea is the same, which is forces people to do things involuntarily that they wouldn't want to do any otherwise. And whenever you, in public policy, whenever you apply force in the marketplace, you are always going to create distortions that hurt people.
Speaking of force, as you point out in the study, this initiative would have a lot of teeth on landlords, and if they failed to follow the guidelines of this initiative and keep rent increases within a certain amount prescribed by the initiative. Describe what kinds of government teeth landlords, I hate that term landlords, property owners, housing providers, home providers and apartment providers, describe what kind of teeth they'd be facing.
Yeah, so these are basic mechanisms that again have all the marks of a rent control. And that is that the landlord has to pay a relocation assistance that can be thousands of dollars to a tenant if the rent goes up by more than 8% in any 12-month period. If the landlord does not follow through, there's legal liability for lawsuits is included in the initiative. If the property owner loses, they have to pay up to 90 days or they have to pay double the relocation assistance they would have had to pay otherwise. We did some quick math based on the average rent in the Bellingham area, and that penalty works out to be about $7,000 or $8,000 for any property owner who doesn't follow the mechanics of the initiative. Well, the effect of that is to cause property owners to not have units available for rent. And you make a good point about landlord, where you tend to think of a huge apartment building with dozens of apartments in it. Very typically, the housing market is 1 or 2 units, someone renting a single home that they have, or having a renter come and live in their home. There are exceptions for some of these personal connections. But as you know, in the rental market, sometimes an apartment house can have 4 units in it, and it's just run by one family, and that's their main investment or their main business. So the idea that there are, massive slumlords in Bellingham who are taking advantage of people, that is not how the market is set up there.
One of the complaints that gives voice to proposals to control rent is, hey, housing's getting increasingly expensive. And if you think housing prices are bad, try trying to find some place to rent. In fact, I've spoken with several people in various scenarios telling me about how they've been trying to find a place or seeing outrageous rent at a studio place. And inevitably their question is, well, without rent control, how do we get these prices under control?
Right.
What kinds of policies would you suggest?
Yeah, so we looked at that as well. So there's a section in our Citizens Guide to the initiative in Bellingham that looks exactly at these kinds of cost drivers which government has created on housing. And ironically, the city council members of Bellevue took a pass on the rent control, voting on the rent control initiative. And yet they control all of the tax burden, the sales tax, property taxes, the zoning rules in the Bellingham areas. And it turns out that the regulations that they have created increase the cost of housing. But we just look directly at, calculator math as to the regressive sales tax that they impose and regressive property taxes. So a common sense solution is that if public officials want to make housing more affordable, they could lower the property tax. How about that? That would lower the cost of housing for everyone. So these kinds of taxes and policies contribute to driving up the cost of housing. And Bellingham leaders could look at those first before they add even more distortion onto the market.
What's one of the ways that that Bellingham, you say here that they increase the cost of housing by charging up to $25,000 to add a single house.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, so that's just the normal, unfortunately normal permitting process. So we contacted the development office in Bellingham and just asked them straight up, what does it take to build one more housing unit from scratch to add in the Bellingham housing market? And the answer was about, on average, by the way, $25,000. And that's all the permitting, all the fees, all the planning. And in our analysis, we didn't even build in the cost of time. So getting approval to add housing takes months and months. And so that's another thing that delays access to housing. So our point with that illustration was to show how without a vote of the people or a campaign or politics of any kind, the leaders in Bellingham could literally snap their fingers and cut the cost of creating a new housing unit in half by just looking at their own policies.
In some cases, I've heard from builders that have said, hey, there's so many restrictions on property or on density and other things where, we just can't find places. We want to meet more demand. We want to create more homes, but we're not allowed to do that. How can we be allowed to do that? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, so that's a larger issue that has to do with the State Growth Management Act that was enacted back in the 1990s, and that restricts the kind of building in new areas outside of a city like Bellingham, which is already built up. So a city can make adjustments to its internal zoning to make more lots available for housing. But the larger issue is that cities are not able to expand normally as they have in the past. So the main thing that provides competition for landlords in Bellingham is when new housing units are added in outlying areas. And that creates choices for tenants, and that causes all rents to become more, to either flatten out or decline, because it's like any other consumer product. When there are more choices, more competition, then the price of it goes down.
Do you see this kind of proposal as having statewide implications or broader implications than just Bellingham?
Yeah, it definitely does. And in fact, the Seattle City Council has looked at these same kind of punishments on property owners if they don't meet certain standards regarding relocation assistance or rent increases. So other cities across the state are definitely looking at this. And so if Seattle and Bellingham go this direction, you could expect other communities to do the same thing.
Thanks, Paul. Now what I'd like to do is bring everyone back forward, Mark Harmsworth and Jason Mercier, and get to our Q&A section and cover anything that we might have missed. If you have a question for Mark, Jason, or Paul, just enter it into the Q&A box. It should be on the bottom or on the side of your screen. Let's start with any chance of Seattle initiative against the income tax. What would it take to start one, or would that be politically risky? Well, Jason, Spokane voters, 72% said no to an income tax. Why no anti-income tax measure in Seattle?
Interestingly, when the city council passed their income tax in 2017, they didn't put it to the ballot. So maybe they were a little bit concerned about what would happen. Is there a chance? You can file it, you can get the signatures, you can see what happened, but maybe your effort would be better trying to get the statewide ban in place.
Let's go to a question for Paul. The way Bellingham Initiative number 4 is written, it would actually mean that a landlord or property owner would have to pay relocation fees even if the tenant chooses to move and the landlord property owner doesn't do anything. It's a very poorly written with no safeguards. Is that accurate, Paul? Are you seeing this as something that they could be stuck with even if it had nothing to do with rent increases?
Yeah, because this is the classic kind of socialist idea of being generous with other people's money. And that's exactly how Initiative 4 is written, is that all of the cost and burden is shifted through the force of law onto a private party, in this case, the property owner. So that observation is right. All of the public benefit that is supposed to come from this initiative is shifted onto private people. It's not a public program at all. It's a direct limitation on what private individuals are able to do with their own property.
Next question. We've been trying to build a set of apartments for over 2 years. They're still in permitting and the fees are outrageous. They say they want low rents, but then make it impossible to do so as a builder. I just wanted to get overall impressions. Who would like to respond? Paul, we'll start with you.
Well, yeah, that's a classic case study that, again, we as an independent think tank, we come across these examples all the time. And it just shows how these higher costs are artificially built in based on deliberate decisions that have been made by elected officials. Of course, the elected officials themselves on the city council and even at the state level, they have an incentive to keep cases like this hidden. They don't go out and talk about how they've layered on massive permitting costs and, in this case, 2 years of process before new housing can be constructed. So in the public sector, they try to keep that behind the scenes, but that's not what people experience every day in the real world. And this is a good example of that.
Mark, I saw your hand up too.
Yeah, I would say I'm going through this process right now. I'm trying to build a house, and I am amazed, not that I didn't know it existed, but the levels of bureaucracy. You need permits for permits for permits. In order to get your water permit, you need adequacy, you need your chlorine, you need all the oxidation tests and all the different things. And all of this adds up. And I've started digging. I haven't laid a brick yet. And I'm into this thing $20,000 already, just in permit fees for one house. I can't imagine what it's like for a developer wanting to build 10 houses in a lot. Maybe they've got 5 acres that they've managed to subdivide and they want to build some low income housing. How can that be low income when you're spending so much money on permits just to even put a brick in the ground, and then to have the state shut down and say you're not shovel ready really just adds salt to the wound of how much you've actually paid to get there in the first place. So yeah, we definitely need reform on our licensing. We need some kind of streamlining, plus just the navigation of trying to work out who you talk to. My water permit was 4 different departments of the county, which were disparate across the whole area. So incredibly difficult, definitely needs streamlining.
Hey, Dave, very briefly while we're on regulations, you may have heard this past session, there was a proposal to ban natural gas in commercial and residential buildings. Didn't go anywhere. It's still very much alive. If you haven't heard of the State Building Code Council, you need to pay attention and you need to testify, because since they couldn't do it through the legislature, they're trying to do it through this very small State Building Code Council that will prohibit natural gas in commercial and residential construction.
Why would they do that? What's the is this a climate issue, or and what alternative energy source would they like us to move to?
Well, we're supposed to not use the natural gas. We're supposed to use the electricity, but then they want to tear down the dam. So then I guess we're supposed to use the wind. I don't know what we're supposed to use.
Yeah, I mean, that's, natural gas is a better alternative than some things, and there's trade-offs to all things. So yeah, that's crazy. Real quickly, I know this section actually reminded me a lot of one of our former annual dinner speakers, Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana. I remember he started the speech, and I wasn't working for WPC at the time, but he was talking about the Department of Licensing, and when he came in, he was asking people about, how long it took them to deliver a license or how long it took them to get a permit. And part of the problem was a cultural problem where people thought that their objective was to find what's wrong with any given site instead of trying to find a way to make the project go forward. And it was just that shift that managed to greatly reduce the length of time required for various permitting. And even he was even able to reduce some of the costs, if I remember correctly.
So we have proposed, Dave, a very simple policy change that would make public agencies much more responsive to citizens. And that is, in the case of what Mark is describing, or the people who are trying to build an apartment house, is you apply for your permit for a building permit or water or utilities or whatever it is that you're trying to construct. If you do not receive an answer in 30 days, then the permit is automatically approved. So if we had that kind of system, I think that we would get a lot more respect from the bureaucrats in these agencies and even from elected politicians, because instead of needing the government's approval to go forward, the default position would be you're automatically approved unless they can give you a reason why you shouldn't do it.
Yeah, makes sense. There's a strange phenomenon where I feel like I look around, and whether it's a transportation or building projects, I feel like it's very difficult for us to build anything anymore, to fix basic things. And there's all this bureaucratic glue that's put forward. It slows projects down or makes them prohibitively expensive when you look back and you're looking at inflation adjusted dollars that we're able to accomplish big things that we should still be able to do. Real quickly, next question. Do you know how likely the rent controls and scheduling initiatives will pass? Are there any polls on these? Anyone seen any polls on the Bellingham issues?
Yeah, I haven't seen any polls on the initiative 4. The main problem is whether people understand that it's a rent control proposal that will hurt tenants and actually drive up the cost of housing. But I haven't seen any polling on it yet.
Likewise, but I would say, based on how fast it bombed in the legislature last year, I would hope it would do the same in Bellingham. However, the initiative language is very, very not deceptive necessarily, but it definitely makes you're not really seeing what's going on. It sounds very good and flowery and like, hey, let's go, let's protect the workers. But it's when you take it to the next level, when you take a look at really what's going on and understand the issue, that's when it's obvious this is a very bad initiative for not just Bellingham, but Washington as well.
Yeah, that was part of my take as well. The language of the initiative is so relocation services, for example, that just sounds so wonderful. Who's gonna oppose that? So you have to look and see what's the actual policy, what are the trade-offs, pros and cons, and then make an educated decision from there. Well, gentlemen, thanks so much for making the time on this election edition of Washington Policy on the Go. The publications of the Citizens Guides to Bellingham's Initiatives 1 and 4 are available at washingtonpolicy.org, as is the Yakima proposal, the income tax ban. We have each of those things. And we have these publications are available. If you have friends that are in either Yakima or Bellingham, share them. And if you don't live in either of those towns, you can read about them and be educated for the issues as they come up, because we expect these issues to be broader beyond those particular cities and possibly statewide. We'll be back next month with another episode of Washington Policy on the Go. If you have not attended our annual dinner event, there's still time. In Spokane, we'll be there this Friday, hearing from Dr. Ben Carson, our keynote speaker, celebrating our 25th anniversary as Washington Policy Center. If you can't make it to Spokane, virtual tickets are available. Just go to WPCdinner.com. That's WPCdinner.com and register for that today. Thanks so much. And thanks, Paul, Jason, and Mark.
You bet.